If James Bond were to defend against the king's pawn, then he'd choose the Alekhines. 1 knight f6. It's dangerous, racy, and bloody hairy. The Aston Martin of chess openings. It leaves your opponent shaken, not stirred. Kitsch aside, I've been playing the Alekhines ever since I was 15 years old, when I decided that the Sicilian dragon was both too turgid and theoretical. I gave the fire-breathing bishop the boot and hankered after Alekhine's horse. Here I've prepared for you a repertoire that combines state-of-the-art development, in particular the new Kangas Variation, along with my own tried and tested pet lines. First up is the 4 pawns attack. On his second move, white shifts his e-pawn up to e5, attacking the black knight. The black knight then jumps into the d5 square in the centre of the board. White plays his d-pawn up to d4. Black challenges the centre with pawn to d6. White then once again attacks the knight in the centre with pawn to c4. The knight drops back to b6, and white bolsters the centre with his f-pawn up to f4. Of all lines against the Alekhine, this is white's most uncompromising. He tries to destroy black with a whole mass of pawns in the centre. However, I'm going to show you one of my pet lines which completely undermines this position for white. It goes as follows. First we capture in the centre with pawn captures pawn. White naturally captures back with the f-pawn to retain the central pawn mass. And now we prepare to fianchetto our king's bishop with pawn to g6. This is a slightly unusual system for black, but also a very good one. I'll let you into a little secret. My lifetime score with this system is in the 80 to 90% region. Second up is the rather dual-looking knight to c3, when white tries to spoil our fun. However, after pawn to d5, immediately challenging the centre, white pawn pushes up to e5, attacking our knight. We jump into e4 with our knight, and after knight c to e2, pawn to f6, pawn to d3, challenging our knight, we drop our knight back to g5, leaving white a little hot under the collar. This is considered the cutting edge of this line. More mediocre white alternatives will also be considered. In the third system, white gives chase to our horsey, first with the e-pawn on e5, knight to d5, and then secondly with the c-pawn, pawn to c4, knight to b6, pawn to c5, knight back to d5. This variation can be a little tactically tricky for black, but is positionally dodgy for white. Then we move on to the exchange variation. After pawn to e5, knight to d5 once again, pawn to c4 attacking the knight, knight drops back to b6, pawn to d4, black pawn to d6 challenging the centre, and here white plays pawn takes pawn on d6. I will recommend the dynamic recapture. C-pawn captures the pawn on d6. In this variation, white tries to avoid the burden of supporting a large centre, however black can still whip up some very dangerous counterplay. And finally, and hot off the press, we'll look at the all-new Kangas variation against white's main line. White pawn to e5, black knight jumps into d5, white pawn shores up the centre with d4, black pawn challenges on d6, and then the white knight hops out to f3. This is a very sensible way for white to play. He will develop his minor pieces on central squares and then castle kingside. Black in turn has been experiencing difficulties in the main lines after both pawn from g7 to g6, and also after bishop from c8 out to g4, pinning the white knight. Both of these moves are currently under something of a cloud. Help is at hand. The all-new Kangas Variation, which has come to prominence over the last year or two, currently has a plus score at Grandmaster level for black. It occurs after black immediately captures on e5 with a pawn, d captures e5, white naturally recaptures with his own knight, and then black prepares to fianchetto the bishop with pawn from g7 to g6. This is a positionally well motivated approach where black fights back for control of the centre. Here we go with a 4 pawns attack then. If black isn't careful, then he can be ripped limb from limb. After 2e5, knight jumps to d5, white pawn to d4, black pawn challenges with d6. White can here play the rather poor f4. Surprisingly, I've even had a couple of title players play this line against me. But after d pawn captures e5, f pawn captures e5, black challenges immediately with a very strong move, c5. It is white here that has to be very careful. In fact, in the game Zapata versus Tal, the Colombian played pawn to c4, challenging the knight, but missing the response, knight into b4, a very strong move. Zapata tried to hold his centre by pushing his d-pawn onwards, which at first looks an impressive centre, but the problem is that after bishop out to f5, black is threatening knight into c2 with a horrible fork. The only sensible way for white to defend against this is with knight to a3, defending the c2 square. Black now detonates the centre, pushing his e-pawn up to e6, threatening to capture both on d5 and to play queen out to h4 check. White is already in very serious trouble and was taken down the laundrette. Instead of the dubious move f4, the right way for white to play the 4 pawns attack is to challenge the black knight immediately with pawn to c4. The horse jumps back to b6, and then white bolsters the centre with the f-pawn, pawn up to f4. When I first started playing the Alekhines, around a dozen years ago, I learnt a little known line that has served me well ever since. Has your interest been tweaked? Okay, here she goes. First I capture on e5 with my d-pawn. The only sensible recapture for white is with the f-pawn. And now I prepare to fianchetto my bishop with pawn to g6. Black's strategy here is to play bishop to g7, castle kingside, and then slam the white centre with pawn to c5. This is a simple but highly effective plan. I'm softening up the white centre and opening up the long diagonal for my black bishop. Most white players usually continue here with knight to c3. We then develop our bishop to g7 as said. Then white develops the other knight to f3. We castle kingside. And then white develops the dark square bishop on e3, supporting the vulnerable d4 square. Here we slam the centre with c5. Not unnaturally, most white players try to keep their centre with a seemingly strong d4 to d5. However, in reality, this centre is far too fragile. I've won many a game after the moves Black bishop out to g4, pinning the knight that defends the e5 pawn. White responds with bishop from e3 to f4. I hit the e5 pawn once again with a b8 knight, shifting to d7. White then responds queen from d1 to e2. But after the manoeuvre queen from d8 to b8, White has run out of ways to defend the e5 pawn and cannot move it without losing his bishop on f4. Alternatively, after White pawn to d6, Black can simply capture, and after White recaptures on d6 with the e5 pawn, simply play rook to e8 when White is jolly embarrassed. An alternative move for White, after Black's bishop comes to g4, pinning the White knight, is to capture the c5 pawn with his bishop. However, after knight 8 to d7, attacking the White bishop, if the bishop retreats to d4, we capture on e5 with our knight with an excellent position. If instead White captures on b6 with a bishop, we simply recapture with our queen, winning all the dark squares on the board. Here White's burnt out husk of a centre resembles a silver-tinted Audi after a joyride on an Oxford council estate. White's king is unlikely to be able to castle either side. Black is threatening to capture on both b2 with the queen, and also on e5 with either the knight or the bishop. Furthermore, at a suitable time we can throw in bishop, capturing on f3. White's best move in this critical position is the unaesthetically orientated d-pawn captures c5, and after the Black knight retreats to d7, to play e6, shattering Black's kingside pawns. After Black captures on e6 with the f-pawn, White normally plays queen to c2, and after queen to a5, bishop to e2, preparing to castle. Black normally captures on c5 with a knight, and after White castles, Black brings out the other knight to c6, exerting pressure on the central squares. In this position, White has better placed pieces and fewer pawn weaknesses, but let's face it, he's got fewer pawns. If, for example, White now proceeds with a3, Black has the option of chopping the White knight on c3, shattering White's queenside pawns. The middle game battle is likely to take place down the f-file, and also on the 4 central squares, where Black is well placed to meet this challenge. All this said, in over a dozen years of playing the Alekhine, I've only ever reached this position in a tournament once. I won. My best advice to you is to rub your hands with glee when White bolsters his centre with f4, and chuckle as you capture on e5, f captures e5, and then fianchetto your dark square bishop. Knight to c3, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, bishop to e3, looking forward to that thrusting of the c-pawn. And should White then try the popular d5, his centre will soon be in its death throes. Two knight to c3 is hardly one of the most alluring and inspiring of White responses to the Alekhine. Usually it's a sign of timidity, though sometimes it's an astute psychological choice. I'm going to recommend to you the most combative move, which is d5, striking immediately in the centre. An incredibly large number of white players here play the insipid e captures d5, knight recaptures in the centre, and then white recaptures once again with a knight. But after queen captures on the d5 square, black has achieved an improved Scandinavian defence, where white doesn't have the opportunity to hit the queen on d5 with the knight from b1, because it ain't there. Black can screw down control of the pivotal d4 square with moves such as pawn to c5, knight to c6, and after knight to f3, bishop to g4, and then can either develop the bishop classically by playing e6 and bishop to e7, or alternatively, instead of classically, can play g6 and fianchetto the bishop, which I prefer. After e pawn captures on d5, knight captures on d5, white has a marginally better move than knight capturing on d5 as we looked at just now. This is bishop to c4, putting more pressure on the d5 knight and also the a2 to g8 diagonal. However, after knight to b6, attacking that bishop, the bishop should drop back to b3. I recommend developing your knight firstly to c6, and after white plays knight to f3, bring your light square bishop out to f5. Here white normally continues with d4, developing his final minor piece. We play e6 here. White develops the bishop to e3 to strong point his pawn on d4. We bring our bishop out to e7, preparing to castle. White plays pawn to h3 to avoid letting us pin his knight on f3. And then we come in to a5 with the knight. After white plays queen to e2, we simply capture the bishop on b3, and after white recaptures on b3 with the a-pawn, black's two bishops ensure him a reet dandy middle game. Hippity-hoppeting back, white's best move here is to push the e-pawn forward to e5, attacking the black knight. Black here has three options: pawn to d4, or alternatively knight drops back to d7, attacking the pawn, or thirdly knight into e4. It's the latter of these three that I'm going to recommend. This is the modern move and results in highly original play. White's best move in this position is the rather bizarre looking knight c to e2, retreating the knight. Instead of knight c to e2, a lot of white players push their d-pawn up to d4, which is a weaker move. In this position, I immediately capture on c3, and after white recaptures, challenge the centre with c5, reaching a French defence type position where black has the option of developing his light square bishop outside the pawn chain. I'll give you a sample line which highlights the benefits of black's position. White develops his knight to f3, black does likewise at c6, white develops the bishop to e2, black develops his bishop to g4. White castles, black plays pawn to e6. White plays rook to b1, hitting the pawn on b7, which black defends with rook to b8. White challenges the bishop with h3, and the bishop drops back to h5. White then plays bishop out to g5, attacking the black queen. So we interpose with the bishop on e7. After white exchanges on e7, we recapture with our queen. White then attacks the c-pawn with rook to b5, and we play the clever bishop captures knight on f3. Since after white recaptures bishop times f3, we play the cunning castles. Here if white captures on c5 with a rook, knight captures e5. Since after pawn captures knight, white's rook is en prise to our queen. White saw through this little trick and played queen to d3. But here we can play a6 as black, and after the rook retreats all the way home, we can play b5, advancing on the queen side. White here played queen to e3, but here we can play queen to a7, further attacking white's fragile centre. Since after rook f to d1, bolstering the centre, the move b4 causes white a lot of problems. Black has a chunky advantage in this position. White's centre is about to be decimated, and note the bishop on f3, that is a complete bystander. It is also worth remembering this technique of attack by launching our queenside pawns down the board. It's a technique that's very typical of this line. It's also possible to get this line from a different move order, which you should be aware of. It goes pawn to e4, knight out to f6, and now pawn to e5, attacking the knight. The knight hops into d5, and now white plays knight out to c3. Here black's best is to capture on c3. When white recaptures with a b-pawn, here you should play d5 immediately. And after pawn to d4, hit the centre with c5. Bingo. Anyway, back to the position after the modern knight to e4. White has a second modest move in this position, namely to actually capture the knight. Knight captures e4. Naturally we recapture, and it's interesting here to evaluate the position. Black has a pawn on e4, which at first looks weak. In reality, white's e-pawn is weaker than black's pawn on e4. To boot, black also has the manoeuvre queen from d8 to d4. White's strongest continuation here is to play pawn from d2 to d4, opening up the centre. But after the natural capture en passant on d3, white recaptures with a bishop. We bring out our horse to c6, attacking that advanced and weak e-pawn. White plays knight to f3, which we then pin with our bishop. After the challenge on the bishop with h3, you should simply capture on f3 this time. And after the queen recaptures, play our queen down to d4. White can try the crafty castles, but here we can capture on e5 with our queen. Since after bishop to f4, we can drop back with our queen to f6. This is exemplary play for black, as modelled by none other than Anatoly Karpov. After Rotov as white played rook a to d1, Anatoly played g5, challenging the bishop, and after the bishop captured on c7, AK traded queens on f3, and after the pawn recaptured, played bishop to g7. It's fair to say in this position that black has a pleasant advantage in the endgame, largely due to his powerful bishop and white's shattered kingside pawns. Back to the cutting edge of 2 knight to c3 opening theory. White here plays knight c back to e2 with the idea of trying to trap the black knight. There are various moves here for black, but the one I recommend and have played with a lot of success is the challenging of the centre with pawn from f7 to f6. Most white players here play pawn to d3, attacking the knight, which then drops back to g5. A rather bizarre looking square, but in fact if white plays the weak pawn to f4, we can simply drop back to f7, from where it helps us challenge the centre. Instead, white should play the natural capture bishop takes knight on g5. Naturally we recapture, and now white should play h4. Pawn to g4 here is correct for black, hindering white's kingside development. And after knight out to f4, black should play pawn to g6. I always get a special thrill when I get to play pawn to g4 followed by pawn to g6 on consecutive moves. The main line of this position goes along the following lines. White pushes his pawn to d4 to let his light square bishop out. Black plays bishop to h6, challenging the knight. This in turn drops back to d3, helping to control the c5 square and try and prevent pawn to c5 challenging his centre. Having placed the bishop on h6, black then naturally brings his knight out to a6, looking to play c5, which he does after white plays bishop to e2, pawn to c5, with some highly original play. A game of mine on this line continued. Bishop captures g4, pawn on c5 captures onto d4, pawn to h5 for white, trying to soften up my kingside, but then I played the very cunning knight to c5. Since the knight is defended by the possibility of queen to a5, check. Grandmaster Willie Watson here played bishop captures onto c8. I naturally recaptured this with my rook, and after knight to f3, the move queen to b6 gives black very good practical chances. This modern line can be a lot of fun to play, but shouldn't be used by those of nervous disposition. Original manoeuvres are the order of the day, as black seeks to crack open white's centre. To sum up, after 2 knight to c3, I recommend that black plots the distinctive Alekhine course with pawn to d5, immediately attacking the centre, and after the pawn advanced to e5, goes the whole hog with knight in to e4. Here black has nothing to fear after the more obvious moves pawn to d4 and also the knight capture on e4. After the theoretical line knight c to e2, black is holding his own in the murkier complications after f6. A white system with some bite is the chase variation, which goes as follows. Pawn to e5 once again challenging the knight. Knight into d5. Pawn up from c2 to c4, challenging the black knight, which in turn drops back to b6. And now white plays a move that's camper than Quentin Crisp, namely c5. Naturally, we return the knight to d5. I'm now going to dish up my recipe to defang this chase variation. Black's strategy here is to support his knight on d5 with e6 and then bolster it with pawn to c6, and then start to challenge white's centre with b6. This also affords black the opportunity to fianchetto his bishop on a6. With the exchange of these light square bishops, black is then able to take advantage of all the weak white squares in white's camp. So let's take a look at one possible line after white plays bishop out to c4, attacking our knight. Here we obviously defend with pawn to e6, supporting the knight. And after knight out to c3, we bolster it with pawn to c6. If white here plays the inferior, pawn to d4, we challenge the centre with pawn to b6. And after white captures this pawn, we recapture with our a-pawn. And on knight from g to e2, preparing to castle for white, we play our bishop out to a6, challenging its counterpart. And after bishop drops back to b3, we can now challenge the centre directly with pawn to d6. I prefer black's chances in this position, especially due to the power of his bishop sitting on a6. In this position, knight to e4 is a better try for the advantage for white, although after pawn to b6, knight to d6 check, we naturally capture the knight with bishop times d6. The pawn on c5 captures on d6. We castle our king to safety. White bolsters his centre with pawn to d4, and once again we fianchetto the bishop to a6. And after pawn to b3, supporting his bishop and attempting to bring another pawn to the centre, we seek to undermine the e-pawn and also the d6 pawn with pawn to f6. In this position, black has very good dynamic chances. He can seek to undermine the white centre further with a move like pawn from c6 to c5. Alternatively, he can capture on e5, and after the natural recapture, swing the knight into the f4 square. A key question in this position is whether the pawns on d6 and also the pawn on e5 are strong or weak. Anyone who's had experience of Leningrad Dutch positions will know that these pawns can often become very weak and vulnerable. Another possible line for white in this position is to challenge with a bishop to c4. And after we play pawn to e6, to immediately play pawn to d4. And yes, I think you've got it. Pawn to b6 once again. Here white has the interesting option of queen to g4. And after we capture on c5 with a pawn, white intends to capture our knight immediately. And after our natural recapture, to play bishop out to g5. Black's best here is to play bishop to e7, and after the swap, recapture with a queen. White then captures on the g7 square, attacking our rook. So we drop back to f8 with our queen, not fearing the endgame at all. And after queen to f6, post our rook on the g8 square with command of the g file. I believe black has the initiative in this position, partly due to his g file pressure and his ease of development. He can play moves like bishop to a6, knight to c6, and pawn from c5 captures on d4. More normal here is for white to capture on b6, and for black to recapture, as always, with the a pawn. White develops naturally with knight to f3, and then we challenge the light square bishop with bishop to a6, hunting out those light squares in white's camp. White here can play bishop captures bishop, and now we can play the very cunning rook maneuver, rook captures bishop, with the following idea. White castles, the knight comes out to c6, putting a little bit of pressure on the white centre, and after knight b to d2 we play bishop to e7, preparing to castle as and when, and after knight to e4 we play the very cunning queen to a8, putting pressure down the a file. Take a look at this position. White has no discernible targets. One of his main problems is that he lacks a light square bishop with which to combine a possible kingside attack. This position must be the Alekhine player's dream, especially in defanging this line of the chase variation. I'll give you a few more moves as an example of how black cashed in on this position. White played pawn to a3 to save it. Black played his rook from a6 down to a4, putting a little more pressure on the d4 pawn. And after white played bishop to e3, he didn't bother with the triviality of castling. He got on with the position and played his pawn from b6 to b5. White here seemed to be a little clueless of a plan and played knight f to g5, and after the natural black response, pawn to h6, the horse came back. At this point, black took time out to castle kingside, fearing no reprisals against his king. White posted his rook on c1, and black continued with his queenside initiative, pawn to b4. After the a-pawn captured, black recaptured with the rook. White posted his queen to d2 to defend the b-pawn, and black now played rook f to b8, which saw the culmination of his pressure down the a and b files. I think this is a beautiful position for black. His white square control is incredible, and I love the way his pawns are still posted on squares like c7, d7, f7 and e6, denying white the opportunity to post any knights in towards black's king. Black's strategy in the chase variation of pawn to e6, possibly pawn to c6, and then pawn to b6 and bishop to a6 is very simple but darned effective, and usually results with white running home with his tail between his legs. A frequent visitor to modern tournament praxis is the exchange variation largely due to the Keen-Levy seal of approval. This position is reached after white pawn to c4, black's knight retreats back to b6, and then white captures on d6 with his e-pawn. The recapture that I'm going to recommend is with the c-pawn because I feel it is more dynamic, so c captures d6. If white here plays imprudently with knight to f3, this allows us to whip out our bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Bishop to e2, pawn to e6, developing the bishop classically, knight to c3, bishop out to e7, white castles, black coppers, and after bishop to e3 we then play a very standard idea, namely pawn to d5, challenging the centre. Most white players here rub their hands with glee and play c5, believing they're going to be able to steamroller black on the queen side, but this is hardly ever the case, quite the reverse in fact. It's very important here for black to capture an f3 here with the bishop, and after the bishop recapture to plant the knight into c4. Black's primary plan in this position is to put pressure on white's d4 pawn with both bishop on f6, knight on c6, and possibly after b6 and a recapture, the queen. One of white's major problems in this type of position is the weakness of his backward pawn on d4. Knight to c3 is naturally a superior move in this position, when black has problems developing the bishop on c8. The move I recommend here is to fianchetto the king's bishop with g6. And after bishop to e3, play bishop to g7, bishop to d3 for white, bringing out the minor pieces. Black simply castles. And after white develops the knight from g1 to e2, definitely not to f3, black brings out his other horse to c6. White here completes his development with castle in kingside, bishop to g4. White's best move in this position is to play f3, trying to cause more problems for the bishop, but however we have a crafty resource with bishop back to f5. For if white plays bishop captures bishop, we have a nifty Zwischenzug with knight captures pawn on c4, attacking white's bishop on e3. So for example, if white plays queen to d3, we simply capture the bishop on e3, and after the queen recaptures the knight, play pawn captures the bishop on f5, when black's got the cream, gold top. White's best move in this position is to play b3, bolstering his c4 pawn. But now we can simply capture the bishop on d3, and after the queen recaptures, we hit the centre with d5. After white pushes on with c5, we can simply drop the knight back to c8, with a similar position to one that we'd analysed in the last line. I'll give you a few more moves as an example to show how black gets the upper hand. White here plays queen to d2, looking to try to exchange black's powerful bishop. So not unnaturally, black plays rook to e8. And after rook f to d1, black's pawn up to e6 to allow his backward knight out. White plays bishop to h6, hoping to exchange that fiery bishop. So we simply drop this back to h8, and after bishop to g5, trying to cause problems for our queen, we simply put her on d7. White can play rook a to b1 here, looking to push the b pawn. We can now shift our knight firstly to e7, and after knight to b5, put her on f5, where white's likely to have a lot of problems with his d4 pawn, especially after we play pawn to b6. This manoeuvre of the Alekhine's knight is a very common motif in this defence. First she comes to f6, d5, b6, c8, e7, and finally f5, taking 6 moves to get from g8 to f5, but with such devastating effect. After knight to c3, pawn to g6, white has the spiffing possibility of pawn to a4, a recent innovation. To show you how to deal with this for black, I'm going to show you a recent game between John Shaw and Mark Condy. It went as follows: bishop to g7. White continued with his policy of trying to boot the Alekhine knight around with pawn to a5. The knight retreated to its only square on d7. White then carried on developing with bishop to e3, and after black castled, white played knight to f3. Black decided it was time to challenge the centre with a thematic pawn to e5. White ignored this, playing bishop to e2, not fearing a capture on d4, so black played knight out to c6. White here played pawn to d5, putting pressure on the c6 knight, which in turn retreated to e7. White then followed up with knight to b5, putting pressure on the backward d-pawn. Black defended this with knight to f5, a multi-purpose move which also threatens the bishop on e3. White was tempted by the bait and took the pawn on a7, and then black unleashed the following: pawn to e4, white's knight hopped into d4, black brought another knight into the centre with knight to e5, and after the exchange of knights on f5, black recaptured with the bishop, and here white followed up with queen from d1 to d2. I want you to pause the tape for a minute and try and find for yourself the Kangas variation that black came up with here. Well, did you find it? Let's see. Rook captures bishop on a7. Naturally, white's knight recaptures this, followed by pawn to e3, threatening white's queen, with the idea that after white captures the pawn on e3, black can play the beautiful knight to d3 check, threatening a very nasty pin down the e-file with the rook. So white shuffled his king to f1. Black played rook to e8 all the same. And after the white queen dropped back to d2, black came up with a second exchange sacrifice. Rook captures bishop on e2. White recaptured with a king, and the end was swift. Black's queen came out to h4. White brought his king back to f1 for a little more safety. Black captured on c4 with the queen. White interposed the queen on e2 to stop any nasty discovered checks. And black brought his bishop into d4 A beautiful central square. This incidentally wins white's knight on a7. Not that white's rooks are doing anything at all. After losing this knight, white struggled on another 8 moves before resigning. Though hardly innocuous, the exchange variation is not one to be feared. There are 2 pivotal ways with which black can target white's weak d4 pawn. Here is the first of these. After the exchange of light-squared bishops, black can challenge the white centre with pawn from d6 to d5. After white pushes the pawn to c5, we can then regroup with knight to c8, pawn to e6, knight to e7, and then to f5, gunning for white's d4 pawn, with b6 to follow to boot. The other alternative pawn challenge is with pawn from e7 to e5, to be followed up with knight from b8 to c6, putting further pressure on the d4 square. And if white plays pawn to d5, attacking the knight, drop this back to e7, with play very reminiscent of a King's Indian defence. It is widely known in Grandmaster circles that all the lines we've looked at so far don't pose black any serious problems. The big challenge for Alekhine players is the main line. This is achieved after pawn to e5, knight to d5, pawn to d4, black challenges in the centre with pawn to d6, and now white plays knight to f3. Traditional remedies here for black, such as bishop to g4, or alternatively the kingside fianchetto immediately with g6 and bishop to g7, are currently under something of a cloud, so I'm going to teach you how to kick ass with a Kangas. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and only then do we fianchetto the bishop with pawn to g6. Opponents unfamiliar with this line may immediately go wrong after you capture on e5 by recapturing with their d-pawn and not the knight. Now you can achieve a very good game with the simple bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen, and after pawn to h3, challenging that bishop, simply capture on f3. After white recaptures with the queen, we'll simply play to round up white's weak e-pawn on e5. In the days of the old 4g6 main line, black would often have problems after a move like bishop to c4, knight to b6, bishop drops back to b3, when the d4 e5 pawn wedge would often cause black a lot of problems developing his pieces. Whilst here after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, pawn to g6, in the new improved Kangas variation, black doesn't have the same problems. He has more scope to develop his minor pieces. The variation has many similarities with the Caro-Kann defence. Black will normally try to develop his pieces on squares like g7 for the bishop, play bishop to e6 bolstering his d5 knight, and then challenge white's e5 knight with knight to d7. Should white then retreat his knight back to f3, we have the option of playing our bishop from e6 to g4, pinning the knight to the queen and putting further pressure on white's d4 pawn. Furthermore, black has options of a minority attack on the queen side with moves like pawn to c6, pawn to a5, possibly pawn to a4, and then pawn to b5. Black aims to clamp down on the queen side and possibly create some weak white pawns which he can later pluck off. Furthermore, he hopes to open up the diagonal for the fire-breathing bishop on g7. An important factor in the new Kangas variation is to meet the main move bishop to c4 not with a climb down of the knight back to b6, but instead to bolster that knight in the centre with bishop to e6, so that the knight continues to radiate its power throughout the centre. Before looking at the main move bishop to c4, I want to look at the two main alternatives, namely queen to f3 with a small threat and pawn to c4, immediately challenging the knight on d5. I should mention in passing that white in turn can fianchetto his kingside bishop with pawn to g3, as played by World Championship challenger Viswanathan Anand. This is easy to defuse as follows: bishop to g7, bishop to g2, castles kingside, white castles kingside, pawn to c6, bolstering our knight on d5, rook to e1, bishop out to f5, pawn to c3, supporting white's centre, knight to d7, threatening to exchange knights and leave white with a weak e-pawn, so the knight drops back to f3. And now rook to e8, knight b to d2, and now a typical strike in this position is pawn to e5, which solves all of black's problems. I don't think that Viswanathan played pawn to g3 and bishop to g2 because he felt that these were the strongest moves in the position, but because he was surprised by his opponent Mickey Adams' choice of opening, the Alekhine, in this important encounter. After white plays queen to f3, threatening mate on f7, black should respond with bishop to e6, both bolstering d5 and also supporting f7. The sharpest line that white can play here is pawn to c4, attacking the knight on d5. After the knight hops into b4, threatening the fork on c2, white carries on regardless and chops wood on b7. Black should naturally continue with knight to c2 check, forking king and rook, and displacing white's king from the e1 square. White plays king to d1, we capture the rook. White in turn captures the rook on a8, and now we finally fianchetto our bishop on g7, putting pressure on the knight on e5 with possibilities of chopping this in some lines. After white's bishop to d2, we should immediately hit the centre with pawn to c5, seeking to undermine the knight on e5. White can try the tricky knight to c6, but after knight captures knight, queen captures knight check, we can play the strong bishop back to d7 attacking white's queen, with the following amusing little idea. If white captures with the queen on c5, we simply in turn capture the pawn on d4 with our bishop. With a crafty tactic, we're attacking white's queen, and if the queen were to capture the bishop, we'd be able to play bishop to a4 check with a discovered attack on white's queen, which completely wins that queen. Even if a shell-shock white doesn't capture the bishop on d4, his position is untenable in the long term. His king on d1 will never be safe, and black simply looks forward to castling kingside and basically getting on with the attack. Alternatively, white can immediately play c4 here, challenging our knight in the centre. This again drops back to b6, and after white develops his knight to c3, we fianchetto our bishop on g7. White's best here is to play his bishop to e3, bolstering his d4 pawn. Now black seeks to undermine the knight on e5 with pawn to c5, and after white captures with his d-pawn, we first trade queens on d1. White recaptures with his rook, and only now do we capture the knight on e5. White captures the knight on b6 with a pawn, and then we hack off white's knight on c3, leaving him with double pawns on the c-file. After our pawn capture on b6 with the a-pawn, white's best move is not to take the pawn on b6 because of his a2 pawn, but to defend it with rook to d2. Black then looks to play the knight maneuver, knight to d7, and after bishop to e2, play her to c5. The black knight is now in a strong central square and cannot be undermined by a white pawn. After white castles here, and we play bishop to f5, black has very good practical chances in this middle game. In the Moulton main line, after bishop to c4, black has been scoring some notable victories at the top levels. In the following game, British Grandmaster Michael Adams gets trounced by Norwegian top player Agdestein. It may well have been because of this game that Adams himself took up the Alekhine for the first time in his life against Anand. After bishop to c4, black bolstered his knight with pawn to c6. White castled kingside, and black fianchettoed his bishop. White brought out his knight to d2, and after black challenged the white knight on e5 with knight to d7, Adams brought his knight from d2 to f3 to support her. Black exchanged on e5, and white recaptured with the f3 knight. Instead, if white had taken on e5 with a d-pawn, this pawn would later be a target for all the black pieces. So here black castled, and after white played rook to e1, black further bolstered his d5 knight with bishop to e6. A little trick in this position to be aware of is after pawn to c3, for example, black can then capture on e5 with a bishop, and after the rook recaptures, black can now play knight takes c3, a stunning capture which works because of the discovered attack on the bishop on c4. This is a great trick which many white players have fallen into. Adams correctly avoided this c3 move and dropped his bishop back to b3, where it's protected by both pawns. Alekhine initiated counterplay on the queen side with pawn to a5. And after pawn to c3, both bolstering the centre and providing an escape square for white's bishop, the Norwegian played queen to c7, putting further pressure on the e5 square with possibilities of pawn to c5, undermining white's centre. White's knight retreated to d3. Black then shifted his bishop to f5, challenging the knight again. And after bishop to g5, black played rook f to e8. White's queen came up to d2, and black ploughed on the queen side with pawn to a4, hitting white's bishop. White could resist this Alekhine knight no longer and plucked it off with his bishop, with the idea that after the recapture he manoeuvred his knight to b4, putting a little pressure on the d5 pawn. Black defended this with his a-rook, and after bishop to f4, attacking black's queen, she jumped into the excellent c4 square. White continued rook to e3. Black played pawn to f6, intending to build a big centre with pawn to e5. White played rook a to e1, doubling rooks on the half open file, so black played king to f7, protecting his e-pawn. Black's advantage in this position is unquestionable. He has the two bishops and is poised to dominate the centre with his pawns by pawn to e5. His opening strategy has been a grand success. When British Grandmaster James Howell came up against originator Latvian Grandmaster Edwin Kangas, he tried to outmaneuver him in the opening stakes, but soon came a cropper. The game went pawn to c6, white castled, bishop to g7, the white rook came to e1, black castled, the bishop dropped back to b3 to avoid any nasty little tricks, black bishop to e6, bolstering the centre once again, white pawn to c3, black challenged in the centre with a thematic knight to d7, the white knight retreated to f3, and then black's knight in turn dropped back to c7, offering the exchange of bishops on e6. White took this bishop, and after black recaptured with a knight, Big Jim played queen to b3. Edwin offered the exchange of queens with queen to b6. And now Jimbo shifted his queen to c4, after which the Latvian challenged in the centre with pawn to c5, seeking to undermine white's position. Play continued pawn to d5, and the knight dropped back to c7, offering the e-pawn on e7, which white duly took with his rook. Black's idea in this position is to meet this move by shifting his queen across from b6 to d6, where he forks both the rook on e7 and the pawn on d5. The white rook dropped back to e1, black captured with the queen on d5, and then white played knight to a3, defending his queen on c4. Kangas' novelty in this position is to play knight to b6, when black has a very pleasant position. This is largely due to the weakness of white's queen side. For example, as in the game, after the queen exchange on d5, black recaptures with his c-knight. White finally brought out his bishop to g5, whereupon black challenged this with pawn to h6, a very useful move. The white bishop dropped back to d2, and now black played the very strong knight to a4. Here white faces a very uphill struggle as he tries to cope with the marauding black knights and black bishop on g7, exerting great pressure on his queenside. In the game, the British Grandmaster was finally dismantled by the originator of this variation. In conclusion, I think that the Kangas variation has much to recommend itself. Firstly, its molten theory. White is usually caught unawares and is unfamiliar with its subtleties. It is only over the last couple of years that black's best strategies have come to prominence. And secondly, with moves like bishop to g7, pawn to c6, bishop to e6, castles kingside, and knight to d7, black's development is straightforward and its position is fundamentally sound. The Alekhine is currently one of black's top scoring defences to 1e4. It is easy to see why. You dictate the opening from move 1 and create immediate imbalance in the position. Understanding the forces at work, you too can reap the rewards.